the informed investor. Thanks to Century 21. Smarter, bolder, faster. Go to century21.com.au.
We're lucky enough on Mondays to be joined by the chairman of Century 21, Charles Tarbey. He's out on the road again tonight. Charles, good evening to you.
I am, Steve, and I have some sad news. I've injured my shoulder, and golf looks like it's out for a little while.
How long? That'll drive you crazy.
It does. It's one of the most challenging things, I'm sure you know, one of the most challenging things you find in life. And the simple game of playing golf, which I used to bag my brother out for playing all the time, now I'm hooked. But sadly, I'll have to see what the doctor says soon.
Oh, so there you are, sitting there watching the Byron Nelson on TV this morning going, go Mark Leishman, but I can't play for 6 months.
I can't play anyway, but anyway, that's another story.
Speaking about issues that we need to resolve, I'm both a landlord and a tenant.
Right.
Do tenants, do you think, have enough rights when it comes to renting a property from either an investor or from directly from a landlord or from a real estate agent?
Look, certainly. Best advice a tenant can get, like I could give a tenant, is to make sure they do it through an agent, not direct with a landlord, because that in itself creates conflict. Yeah, I mean, there are some landlords and tenant relationships that are fantastic, but because the legislation is just being piled on in different parts of the country, it's certainly different. It becomes increasingly difficult, and sometimes landlords, the ones that are not as educated as others, will just turn up at a property because they own it and feel that they can knock on a tenant's door whenever they want. And there are issues
which
like
is
that.
A no-no. You can't do that.
Absolute no-no. And things like getting repairs done and maintenance work. In my experience as a property manager back in the early days, one of the biggest problems I used to have was getting landlords to fix things for tenants. And, of course, it's changed so much now that I think tenants have certainly got a lot more rights than they had. But there are areas of concern. I think the Victorian government have really put a lot more pressure on landlords. The New South Wales government, not as much. But I do think that tenants get a bad break because many tenants that I found over the years are people who sometimes own property elsewhere, Steve, and they're either renting in a certain spot to find out what it's like to live there, or they've been transferred.
Yeah.
And so many of the tenants that I did business with became buyers, became investors, and became people that you did a lot of work with. Whereas a lot of time the industry sees a tenant as a second class citizen.
Which has to change because, I mean, because the real estate scene is changing before our very eyes, the percentage of people who are permanent renters, who always will rent, is growing, not declining.
It's significant, yeah.
So the rights of those people have to be taken into the thinking of the landlord, because the New South Wales government says, look, we're not going to abolish no grounds evictions. I mean, look, if you're a landlord and you want to free up the property and the lease runs for another year and you want to get rid of the person, can you really just say, I want you out?
Yeah, well, you shouldn't. You've signed a contract, and you, just as you expect a tenant to be obligated to the terms of the contract, so should you as a landlord. And that's a risk you take as an investor. But my advice to landlords and even to the people I work with as the owner of property, I do a lot more for them than other landlords might. For example, in one particular property I make sure the lawns and everything is maintained at my expense because the tenants are good people and I want them to stay. So I make my property more attractive for them to stay in than other landlords might. And I think it's a case-by-case basis. There are some landlords that are terribly painful and do the wrong thing, and there are also tenants that are painful and do the wrong thing. And
see, as a tenant, I rent a place where sometimes I might only be there 1 or 2 nights a week.
Yeah.
I would have thought the landlord would have been happy to have less wear and tear on the property and
Correct.
A permanent tenant who's paying the rent on time.
And you'd be the sort of tenant that I'd want to attract because of that. And a real investor, a serious investor, keeps property for the long term. I think one of the biggest issues is that there are some people who are not seasoned investors, Steve. They get into something. I've seen cases of this, and where they need to sell, and they can't. And often you find that people can actually lose their entire asset and their family home because they haven't invested correctly to start with. And I've also seen situations where tenants on the opposite side haven't paid their rent, goes to the tribunal. The tribunal has to, by rights, give the tenant some leeway. And, of course, there's a landlord who's sitting there, might be first-time investor, and they can't pay their mortgage. So there's issues on both sides. Generally, it runs pretty smoothly, but legislation is definitely being piled on right across the country.
We're talking to Charles Tarbey, Chairman of Century 21. You and I love a coastal town. There's been a survey done on some of the New South Wales coastal towns that in real estate terms are booming. Where are they?
Well, you picked one recently. We talked about the South Coast. And that's probably one of the most unexplored, wonderful places in the country. And whether you're a Melbourneite or a Sydneyite, you're almost halfway between the two capital cities in some respects. When you get all the way down to places like Bermagui and they're just magnificent. And
Narooma.
Yeah, and these are areas that personally I've only just discovered because I drive down south, but I'd nudge down a little bit further. And only recently I went down with my son and we went for a dad and son weekend away, and we found ourselves further down the south coast than I'd been in a long time.
Bermagui, Pambula,
yeah,
just stunning places.
Stunning restaurant, but the prices are fantastic for those areas, and those areas are still booming, like regional areas, because they've still got that halo effect from Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, well, it's particularly Melbourne and Sydney, where people gained a significant amount of equity over the last few years, and they're spending it.
Places like Ulladulla, Sussex Inlet, Berry, now that the highway, you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, the bypass goes around. All of those places are sensational. And you could just say the same, would you not, about the mid-north coast?
Yep, easy to get to, and particularly the mid-north coast, because the highway up there, the Pacific Highway, has been bypassing a lot of the smaller areas, and you can get to those areas very, very quickly. I mean, the Blue Mountains, again, we used to be a weekend trip. Now it's a day trip, and people are just up and down. And there's some just fabulous, fabulous places in Australia on coastal areas. So
some of these places, what we're saying to people is if you're thinking about going, you might want to make your mind up a bit sooner rather than later, because these places are starting to take off.
They have been, Steve. They have been, and rightly so.
Yeah, I mean you've got to pick your moment, don't you? You've got to pick your time. You've got to say not go too early, not go too late, because in the past we've seen a lot of these places actually go backwards the moment you have something like a global financial downturn.
They are the first place that people sell. You're not going to sell your family home before you sell your holiday home, and that's the reason that they have there's so much volatility in that marketplace. We were telling people 2 or 3 years ago, you want to buy your holiday home, buy it now, because that's what happens. And I think change in interest rates or change in equity markets, the first places that crash are those areas.
You always give us fabulous advice. We'll see you in the studio next week.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Charles Tarbey there, the chairman of Century 21. He's quite right. Some of those coastal boom towns, if you think you're moving, make up your mind in a hurry.